Hi everybody. I just wanted to send you a quick video thanking you for your responses to this past week's reading. I was very, very pleased with your remarks. And I thought you did unusually well, especially for the first very hectic week in the semester, to respond so thoroughly and so thoughtfully to work by Charles Brockden Brown, and also, in one case, to D.H. Lawrence's The Spirit of Place. So I just wanted to make a few general comments. I hope you've all received my particular comments on your own work. But I wanted to make some general comments about things that many of you touched upon in your responses. First of all, in this case, I'll be talking mostly about Charles Brockden Brown's somnambulism, since the great majority of you focused on that particular story. First of all, many of you noted the important tension between enlightenment and romantic thought that gets played out in this story on various levels. Certainly at the level of the plot, but perhaps more importantly, at the level of a kind of the inner conflict in Althorp himself. Right? When we think about the Enlightenment again, right, the word tells us a great deal about the kind of values of that age. Right? It's an age that values reason and that values, in some senses, the public, whereas Romanticism, and particularly dark Romanticism, is much more interested in the emotions than in reason, and believes, right, that the emotions are in some sense dominate over reason, and it's also much more about introspection, about privacy. So you can see that tension in the story, right, and that tension is embodied in Althorp. But when Charles Brockden Brown writes the story, he's also thinking about the transition that the United States is in at this moment, right? It's post-revolutionary, it's a very early post-revolutionary story, and he's thinking about how we're moving as a culture away from an Enlightenment mindset, right, into a romantic, and in this case particularly dark romantic mindset. You also talked a great deal about Gothic conventions. And I think that some of you must have at least had some experience, if not with the American Gothic, then with the British Gothic or the European Gothic, because you mentioned some of the very important distinguishing characteristics of the Gothic. And I say this in the lecture, but I think it's worth just noting it here rather informally. The Gothic does not so much denote a time period, right? It's not like a movement when we talk about something like realism or romanticism or modernism, right? The Gothic is more of a style and a mood, right? And in that mood, in that style, it tends to be dark, right? It tends to be infused with a sense of mystery. Right? It is very, very much about the darker emotions. But there are some important differences between the British and the American Gothic, or I should say the European and the American Gothic. If you think about the European Gothic, you will often find that the negative force, right, the disturbing element, is one that comes from the outside, right? It's something that invades from the outside. But the American take on the Gothic, and this is really so important, not just for Charles Brockden Brown, but as you'll see for Hawthorne and especially for Poe, in the American Gothic, the threat, right, the negative or dark or disturbing element, comes from within. And oftentimes that interiority, that withinness, right, is represented by the terror being inside the house, right? This kind of connection between the house and the head, the interior of the body, right? The interior of the dwelling is precisely where the Gothic lives. Many of you also talked about the nature of desire, and particularly the nature of subconscious or also repressed desire. And you were thinking kind of in a post-Freudian way, whether you've read Freud or not, about the consequences of repressed desire. Right? In Althorp's case, the consequences of repressed conscious desire become really horrific. Right? They become a sort of murderous urge to kill the supposedly beloved. You also talked somewhat about the blurring of fantasy and reality in Charles Brockden Brown's narrative. And that will be a continuing theme in American romantic works. So a very, very important one as well. And some of you did something that I was very, very pleased to see, and that is that you began to think about Brockden Brown's tale in a structural way. Several of you commented very meaningfully on the use of ellipses and on the fragmentary nature of the story, and how that structure also has to do, in many ways, with the kind of uncertainty, the mystery, the introduction of doubt that very much typifies the American Gothic. And finally, a few of you did, in a very charming way, right, introduced the scene of your own reading, right, the scenes in which you read the story. And I was surprised, and I must say also delighted, to hear that several of you at least read the story more than once. And several of you took the opportunity to read the story in more than one setting. So you had nighttime readings and daytime readings. You had readings in relatively private, closeted spaces, and you had readings in rather public spaces like libraries. And some of you commented on how the situation, your situation as a reader, really affected the way that you understood the story, and also even the details that you remembered from the story, which is just fascinating. And I'm hoping that you continue to reflect on your own reading process, and what draws you in. What do you remember on a first reading? What appears to you on a second reading? How does the place in which you read affect how you understand the text? And all kinds of other fascinating questions that have to do with reading theory. So that was wonderful. I was very, very pleased with the responses. I also just wanted to give a tiny little preview, right? This coming week you'll be reading Poe and Hawthorne. And of course, Poe and Hawthorne are inheritors of the Gothic and of dark romanticism as it is initially articulated by Charles Brockden Brown. And I think that you will find, you probably have read at least a couple of these stories before. Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, right, very famous, and Hawthorne's Two Tales, The Birthmark and Rappaccini's Daughter, also famous. And I mentioned this in the notes to Hawthorne, but just in case, I'd like you to have it in the foreground of your mind when you're reading. Hawthorne wrote these stories very soon after he himself was married, so keep that little tidbit in mind. Which reminds me about another point that some of you made about Brown, and it was a very good point, very astute. And that's that Brown's heroine, right, in Somnambulism is a woman, right, and it is the woman, in fact, who is the rational Enlightenment figure, as opposed to Althorp, who is the sort of dark romantic figure in the tale. This playing with gender, right, what gender means in America in the late 18th century and 19th century. Certainly these questions will come back to haunt, and I really mean haunt, Poe and Hawthorne. So as you read these tales, right, think about what Poe and Hawthorne are getting from Charles Brockden Brown, and think about how they expand and develop his vision of things. So just a quick message, right, to thank you so much for your very thoughtful responses, and to say that I'm looking forward to the next ones. I hope you'll feel free at any point, right, to send questions or to set up an appointment with me if you'd like to speak more personally. All right, thank you so much, and see you soon.